guest today is Hadil Al-Muwafaq, a research fellow at the Yemen Policy Center. We are going to dive into the situation in Yemen and explore how this conflict is and will continue to have a significant impact on global security. I'm MJ Benayas, and welcome to SitRep. This is your intel report on the Yemen conflict.
Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. We're going to talk about Yemen and the current situation that's happening. I know there's been updates. I know it's been a long war. I know that this has been going on for 8 years now. So we have a situation prior to 2014 where Yemen is kind of in this loose peace, and there's multiple parties that seem to be sort of vying for power in Yemen. You have the Houthis in the north. I know there's a southern separatist group that wanted to break Yemen sort of in half, as it sort of had traditionally been, from what I understand. There was always sort of a North Yemen and a South Yemen. Is this true? Is this was there kind of like a cultural divide?
So there is no cultural divide per se. So historically, the southern Yemen was under the British control. So it was occupied by the British, while the north was occupied by the Ottomans, who then were replaced by the Mutawakkili or Mutawakkilite or the Imamat. It's a theocratic regime, and who are the ancestors of the Houthis as well.
Right.
Um, so it's this divide that happened. It's political divide. It is not cultural. We share the same language.
Okay.
We share the same traditions and everything else.
So then we have a political divide then between the north and the south. So the Houthis are sort of vying for, well, have always kind of controlled the north, and now currently they're vying for complete control over Yemen. You have a group in the south that wants to divide Yemen, and then you have a sort of Saudi, sort of other Middle Eastern party led coalition that's trying to reestablish the I guess the internationally recognized quote. And if for people who listen to the audio podcast, my fingers are in quotes here. The internationally recognized government that Saudi Arabia and the UAE had backed. So it's just like almost like this trifecta of powers vying for one nation.
Yes, there are lots of actors in Yemen's conflict. There are the local ones. So at the beginning, there was just the Houthis and the government, and then the coalition intervening on behalf of the government, right? But then it got only complicated from there because the anti-Houthi camp it got fragmented into these different camps that oppose one another. So you have the Islah, which is like one of Yemen's largest political parties. It's similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, but they have distanced themselves from them in the past. And then you have the separatists, the southern separatists as well. So the southern separatists, we've always had this Hirak, which is called like the Southern Movement, right? It emerged in 2007. They were demanding, their rights because they had to endure so much injustice under the former regime. And it was a movement demanding rights, not secession per se. But then in 2017, and with the support of UAE, we have the new entity forming with leadership, calling themselves the Southern Transitional Council. And they have been calling for secession ever since. And there are so many concerns about them and about their like increasing power in the South itself, and where people don't tend to kind of associate them with the Southern Iraq per se, because they are working under the influence of UAE, largely under the influence of UAE.
Just for the listeners, just so they understand, just in case, the UAE is obviously the United Arab Emirates, who have thrown their hat into this war as well, fairly recently, from what I understand, compared to Saudi Arabia, but a few years now. But by recent, in an 8-year war, I mean kind of later on in it. Let's jump. So we have kind of a good understanding of who's involved. We have the Houthis. We have the Saudi-led sort of coalition, sort of internationally recognized government. We have this sort of other party in the south. what's the current situation on the ground, sort of politically, when it comes to Yemen? Because I know, over 8 years, a lot of things happen, and I want to jump back to some of those previous events. But let's discuss sort of on the ground right now what's going on.
So right now, the current configuration is that Houthis are in control of much of the northern territories, aside from Madib Governorate, which is the last stronghold of the internationally recognized government in the north. And the internationally recognized government is in control of southern territories, but in reality, there is this power struggle between the government and the southern separatists in the south, and so um, it has been the southern separatists that are on the ground that kind of control like state institutions on the ground, especially security institutions. Um, and the major battles are centered around the governorates of Marib and Shabwa, and the reason for this is because they hold the largest reserves of oil and gas, natural gas in Yemen. And so we see the Houthis, the southern separatists, and the government trying to control these territories.
I was listening to an interesting podcast about Yemen, and one thing I didn't know actually prior to doing a lot of research for this episode was Yemen is incredibly resource rich. And the fact that it has access to a whole bunch of ports for trade, Yemen is in this really interesting spot in the Middle East where it has the potential to become sort of an incredibly wealthy, and it was, a very wealthy, powerful nation within sort of the Middle East. But this war has sort of cut off all of these supply lines and supply chains out of Yemen and into Yemen, and different, like as you said, there's sort of these different factions controlling different areas that it's really curtailed Yemen's ability to export oil, export a lot of metal. Copper, from what I understand, is a massive export out of Yemen, as well as a bunch of sort of other products. So it's interesting from sort of the global stage. Yemen has access to a lot of resources that currently really the world economy needs, but it's unable to start sort of moving it out in high quantities because of this conflict.
Well, you could say that it's also because Yemen is rich in resources that we have this war that, it's not ending, because, now we have a lucrative war economy that all of the different war factions, kind of want to sustain. You have the oil, and the discovery of the oil was actually a curse in Yemen because it kind of enabled the regime to extract all of the oil wealth into their own pockets, and it stopped them from developing all of the other economic sectors in the country. And so once the oil production started declining, as because it's a finite resource, eventually, you began to see this internal power struggle among the elites in Yemen. And you could also argue that into that 2011 and the events that how things kind of turned out to be, where you have members of the former regime splitting up and joining the revolutions, also because of this drying up of the oil revenues. So people were kind of fighting over who gets to control the oil revenues. We also have the ports. You're right, and like if you look at the kind of word dynamics, you would realize that they are centering around the strategic places, like who gets to control the ports, who gets to control the oil and gas facilities. So this is where the major battles are happening. And unfortunately, if no one intervenes, no, if we don't have any accountability in Yemen, the war parties are just going to continue waging their wars to control these places on the expense, of the Yemeni population because they don't get access to their wealth. In fact, they're starving.
Right. And I was gonna mention that it's the greatest humanitarian crisis the world currently has. We're dealing with millions and millions of people who do not have access to basic needs. And I want to touch on that. I want to stay focused though on where we are now, because I found it very interesting that I was reading articles that currently there is a ceasefire, a very loose ceasefire that's slated to end in October, for certain key areas between the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition, I guess, or the Saudi-led sort of forces. And that being said, even though there's this ceasefire, there are still fights for major cities, and there's still fights for major ports, and there's violations of the ceasefire all the time. But it seems to be that no one's really doing anything about it.
So the problem is when this war started, it was a way for for like the regional powers, especially Mohammed bin Salman, kind of wanted to have like a quick win in this war, which would have helped him politically in Saudi Arabia. It just that the war stilled, and now we're entering we're well into the seventh year without any decisive victory for either side. And so, and the international community and Saudi Arabia and, UAE, they just, the war cost them so much. And I think I saw a figure that the war cost Saudi Arabia $1 billion a week. So it's really a costly war, and they just wanted to end it in any way. They just wanted to kind of, enter a ceasefire, kind of have an agreement with the Houthis, and just end things. The problem is, Houthis have approached the ceasefire as an agreement between them and the coalition and Saudi Arabia, not between them and the international recognized government. And so what they said is Saudi Arabia, they demanded that Saudi Arabia kind of ceases the military operations in Yemen, right? They didn't mention anything about them seizing their military operations in Madab. They just said, okay, we're going to stop bombing Saudi Arabia and the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and UAE. But they didn't say anything about the internal fighting inside Yemen, in Madab and Taiz, and so far, most of the demands that Houthis have put forward for the ceasefire have been met. And they now we have 18 ships, fuel ships, being allowed to enter Hodeidah port for the Houthis. Now you have, I think, two trips a week from and to Sana'a airport. Um, and then you also have other demands that Houthis put forward, like enabling people with Houthi issued passports to use them to travel. Whereas the other demands put forward by the international recognized governments have not been met, and one of them is kind of to allow to lift the siege on the city of Taz, which Houthis have been besieging for the past 7 years for absolutely no reason but to kind of put pressure and on the city residents. They don't even have any strategic military objective in laying the siege on Taz. They're just doing it as a way to punish the residents of the city. Um, so yeah, so we are in this funny situation where the Houthis kind of keep violating the ceasefire, but the international community and the government, the Saudis, they don't want to say anything about it.
And that's literally where I want to go to next. A lot of the listeners of the show are involved in national security or just domestic security. They're involved. Some of our listeners will definitely be uh, working in places like the United Arab Emirates, working in Saudi Arabia. They'll have offices there, whether it's for business or government or NGOs, whoever, as well as in Yemen. I mean, for the people who are listening, who kind of work in this sort of job market, what's the solution here? How does this end, or does it end? From what I understand, the Houthis are kind of just in it for the long haul. They've secured the areas they've secured. They have money coming in. They have backing from Iran, as far as we know, even though they've denied it. we have the Houthis kind of very strategically kind of placed. They have a good foothold. They're not going anywhere. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, obviously this is costing them a fortune. It's almost like they want out more, but they don't necessarily want rather the Houthis in charge. So like what's like it feels like a chess game, like who's in what position, and how does this board move around?
Yes, I mean, when you look at it from above, like as a like this conflict with as like if you look at it, if you look at just at the conflict actors having decisions and having the final say on how the war, whether it continues or not, then you would reach this conclusion that there is no solution to the conflict because all of those actors just want to sustain the war because um, it's 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 a source of of wealth to all of them. Um, but I feel like, the problem with the Houthis, as you said, is that they don't want to end the war, right? They're benefiting so much from it right now. And just comparing their situation to before the war, they had nothing. And now they are controlling one of the most populous, areas in Yemen. That is the north, where almost 70% of all the population live. And so they're not gonna kind of let go of that. And what the other major problem is that the anti-Houthi camp is so fragmented that it really cannot defeat the Houthis as it is right now. One of the other problems is that it is being controlled by Saudi Arabia and UAE. So the decision making it is not in the hands of Yemenis; it is in the hands of these regional powers. And so if you want to have a fair shot at the Houthis, you would need to build the legitimacy of this presidential council that is now in place. And for it to have legitimacy and to be able to actually, command the army and to it needs to be unified to kind of have some kind of consensus among the members. It's just that there are eight members of this presidential council, and each of them have their own different interests, opposing interests. Right, the separatists have opposing interests to the Islah Party, for example, and that has opposing interests to Tariq Saleh, who commands his own forces. Right, and so if you can't even get the government to kind of to have like a unified command over the army, over the territories that they're controlling, then how can you expect them to defeat the Houthis?
It's funny because because of this division, it seems like it's just this sort of chaotic civil war that the world has seen throughout history for a very long time. But it's a civil war that has sort of incredible economic impact upon not just the Middle East and the players in the Middle East, but really across the globe. I remember an incident, it was in 2019 where the Houthi launched several drones into Saudi Arabia and took out an oil pipeline sort of facility, an oil facility. And for the day, oil prices spiked by like they increased like 70% or something because this oil facility went down. And then we've had other strikes more recently in the UAE at the airport, for example. There was another strike where three people died at another, I think it was another oil facility in the UAE. So we're seeing these impacts that this sort of group are making upon world economies.
So you're absolutely right. The fact that they have been launching these attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, that they have also been kind of attacking UAE. Um, this in itself constitutes a regional threat um, that needs to be contained. Iran is supplying the Houthis with the weaponry, with training, with everything, because it also wants to have its foot in the more than one country in the Middle East. Um, and also Houthis, they have the chance to control international shipping lanes because of the strategic place of Yemen. and you have, Bab el-Mandeb and etc. Um, and so it is really not in the interest of anyone to have a militia controlling this strategic place, these strategic, ports and it's not in the interest of anyone to have a militia being able to kind of attack other countries, um, and this is why Saudi Arabia and UAE have been just focusing on getting the ceasefire. It's almost between them and the Houthis, more than the internationally recognized government and the Houthis. And then you can also look at how the Houthis have been dealing with the FSO Safar tanker, which is this tanker carrying almost a million barrels of oil. Um, uh, Threatens to leak into the Red Sea. And so this in itself, if it happens, it will cause a major environmental catastrophe that would impact the region, the whole region. It will impact, sea lane shipping lanes and all. Um, and the way they have been dealing with it is so reckless. As they don't really understand how grave the situation is. And it's only expected of that from a militia that really doesn't really care what happens to anything, as long as they can use it as a political tool to kind of to exact concessions from the other party. That's all they care about.
So for the listeners who don't know, it's a very old tanker that's been sitting literally just off the coast of Yemen. As Hadil said, it's filled with 1 million barrels of oil, and it's rusting, like it's falling apart. The UN is literally trying to crowdfund the money to go and pull the oil out of it before it just falls apart and puts 1 million barrels of oil into the water. It's they're saying it's going to be the worst oil if it does happen. It's slated to be the worst like the worst oil spill in human history. Um, it's unbelievable that this is one, a thing, but two, that the Houthi themselves wouldn't sort of work with the world community to try and get this situation resolved quickly and sort of effectively. I mean, it currently they're in control of the shipping lanes. I mean, it's their shipping lanes in a sense. Um, is there for the Houthi, is there this long-term understanding that they will eventually govern and they want to govern as a legitimate state? Or is it just they're kind of in it for the short term, pull out as much wealth and power as they can, and knowing full well that eventually this joyride is going to end, I guess? Or is this like a long-term goal? We want to be in control of Yemen and the new government.
So there are differences between the group's ideology, which kind of says, they have a divine right to rule, not just Yemen, but all the way into Saudi Arabia to Mecca, because they claim that they are the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad of Islam. And so this gives them this divine right to rule, um, which kind of, it tells you that they're in it for the long term. But when you look at their actions, when you look at the way that they have set up their governments, um, they really, it's, since 2014, when they first seized control over state institutions, they turned them into this rent extracting institutions that would benefit the group's war effort, and individual members within the movement. Um, and so it is crazy that they have turned, they were able to collect revenues from all of these different institutions to kind of like milking them, um, in a way that no other regime in Yemen have done so. And they also like, um they have been establishing their own state institutions for like, in violations of Yemeni constitutions, and institutions that would only report to the leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. And all the while they don't provide any sort of services to the Yemeni population. Most of the services have been commercialized under, in Houthi areas, like, electricity, like water. Now, even education, like if you want to have, if you want to buy books or, for the curriculum, you would need to buy them off of the black market, because the schools no longer provide them, or they provide them with this pricey, cost. So this kind of behavior is not going to allow them to kind of rule as a state, because they're not behaving as a state. They're behaving as this rent seeking militia. Um,
So, and I guess the big question for me and I guess any listener would be, one, why? I mean, I get the religious aspect. And I totally understand sort of that side of things, but I think even the most religious minded, let's say, militia group would in some way view, or at least have some sort of idea of statecraft, right? How to manage a state properly so that the people are taken care of, because at the end of the day, they're going to be your biggest resistance potentially. The last thing I'm sure the Houthi want is an uprising from just the population in general. And so I guess the question is to you, will is there a sort of a brewing populist resistance against them, or is and or you're nodding your head, and or is there sort of motivation from the international community or from Saudi Arabia and UAE to just end it in a military way, or is that not interesting to them? And I guess I'm asking you a complicated question here. There's so many parts to it. How does this all end? I guess is
there are
where
so many parts to it.
yeah.
So there have been some riots emerging here and there in different cities, but they're really small, because people are really afraid. Houthis are known for holding this very repressive regime. They're acting as this police state. No one can say anything, even like on social media. Otherwise, you'll be detained. But the way they have been going about it is, they have this summer camps, indoctrination camps, and they have been enrolling thousands of children each year, to kind of, to indoctrinate them and have them join the movement. And so they are betting on the newer generation. That's their strategy, and so they're really focusing on schools and, um, and, of course, I mean, at the moment, the problem in Yemen is that all of these political parties have kind of disintegrated, right? They're no longer really there. We no longer have movements or politics, and so people are so fragmented themselves that they cannot, pull up like an uprising or anything against Houthis, at least now, right? And the international community is empowering Houthis by seceding to them each time, in a ceasefire or in the, and the, you know, the problem with military intervention is that Saudi Arabia and UAE have intervened so badly, like they've messed up so bad that it's not a viable option anymore. And as I told you, I think the viable option is that, right now we have liberated areas in the south under the control of the government. So if we can get those liberated, like if you can get the government to, to provide people with, with livelihoods, with, economic opportunities, with et cetera, right? So you need to at least have some areas that are stable in Yemen, economically, politically, um, otherwise, right now, people in Houthis areas, they have no incentive to fight on behalf of this government, of this very divided government. They don't even see it as legitimate, because it is just seen as a puppet under the control of the Saudis and the UAE. And this is why I wouldn't really call the situation in Yemen as a civil war. It's a very much an internationalized war, with these powers still intervening in not only in decision making, but also, the UAE, for example, is directly, controlling the forces, Yemeni forces, yes, but like they're under the control of UAE. Um, and so you cannot have that kind of power defeating the Houthis, right now. And another thing is to kind of try to empower Yemenis who are living under Houthis control, and to do that, you would need to kind of, I'm talking about the international community. They would need to set up like accountability mechanisms in Yemen that would, because right now there's this environment of impunity. Anyone can do anything without, fear of any repercussions. And so you need these accountability mechanisms. You need, instead of international aid, you need economic development. You need to empower people economically because the Houthis are also capitalizing on poverty, right? They are pushing people into more poverty so that they can then promise them like, small amounts of money for them to fight and join the Houthi movements. And that's been working great for the Houthis as well. And so there needs to be a change in the way the international community is dealing with Yemen, right? We don't need this influence, this regional influence on decision making. We need to really have like a good government that is able to provide services to its people, at least in the liberated areas, right? We need to create this pressure on Houthis, to create a pressure that they are really doing badly in comparison to the government. Because right now, like, they are handling things even better than the government is.
Let's. We're almost out of time, but I want to pivot as promised to the situation on the ground for the people, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are dealing with this on a daily basis. You mentioned a lot of interesting things that sort of raised, sort of my ears perked up. Right. So, for example, these education camps focusing on kids to sort of indoctrinate them into a way of thinking, focusing the Houthis focusing on increasing poverty for the purpose of, making it attractive to join the fight in exchange for small amounts of money. Um, we mentioned earlier the United Nations said this is sort of the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. If you had to sort of sum up the life of a person living in Yemen right now, I mean, what's the situation, and then what do they need from NGOs, from the international community? What kind of supports can be put in place to support them as this war just seems to go into its seventh, eighth, ninth, and who knows how long year?
Yeah, so, the situation for Yemeni, citizens themselves or, like, people living in Yemen right now is that, they're living in an economic environment where prices, just keeps getting, higher and higher, especially with the, right now with this Russian-Ukraine war and the rise in international and the prices of foods, of breads, of wheat and all. And just to remind you that Yemen used to import 90% of all of its food. So we are very much a food insecure country. So with the war and with this Russian and Ukraine war, the situation has gotten even worse. Um, People in Yemen, when you ask them what do they want economic opportunities. They want to work, right? And this has been missing pretty much since the beginning of the war. Because all of the international assistance is, it's just aid, it's food baskets, it's giving them oil and etc. Things that don't really improve the lives of Yemenis much. They will last for a few months, and not to mention that a lot, like significant portions of the aid gets diverted, by the conflict actors themselves on the ground. And so you really need to empower people by giving them job opportunities, by also kind of opening up the opportunities for them to try to change the situation. And by that I mean to kind of um to kind of address the human rights violations, to empower activists on the ground, so that they have more opportunities to kind of influence public opinion, to kind of confront these different conflict actors. So yeah, I mean, the situation is really bad. People can't even like move safely between cities. Otherwise, they will have to pass through like hundreds of checkpoints, security checkpoints. Situation is even much worse for women, because now they have to live under this radical religious militia that keeps denying them their rights, their freedom to of movements and etc. Um, so it's looking really bad. But again, I think one of the ways to address this is by focusing on the economic aspects, economic development. This is what we need, as well as accountability mechanisms that would hold the conflict actors to account for what they're doing.
To close, do you see from an international sort of security perspective the Houthis first winning, taking all of Yemen, um, or do you not see that happening? And we can just have like a quick answer here. Like I don't have to get into it, but do you see them winning, or is this is just they're not going to win this one?
So I'm not sure about controlling all of Yemen, because I think what would eventually happen is that Houthis would have control over the north, whereas the southern separatists and the government would have control over the south. Uh, and if we're lucky, it would stay. Not even lucky, but like it would stay like this. That meaning that Houthis are not gonna actually end up, fighting the south. It just that this situation in itself would be drastic for Yemenis to be under the control of militias, both in the north and the south. It will that there's no win for Yemenis in that case.
And the reason why I asked that question is because we know Iran is heavily involved within the sort of the Houthi camp. And I guess, we know the Houthis are able to strike targets within Saudi Arabia, within the UAE, and other sort of states within the Middle East. Um, I guess from again an international security perspective, is there a situation where the Houthis sort of get into more attacks into Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries um, within the Middle East, and they become um, a much sort of broader force that is able to strike targets kind of anywhere in the Middle East and create instability within the region and ultimately affect, Saudi Arabian markets, the markets in the UAE, markets kind of all over the Middle East. Like, is that a possible reality, or would Saudi Arabia, UAE not let that happen? And I'm only using because I know Iran is involved here, and a lot of people view this as a proxy war between really Saudi Arabia and Iran.
This is possible. I would say this is possible not only because of Iran's influence over the Houthis, but also because Houthis, their objectives, they want to expand more. I told you they not only want to control all of Yemen, but under their religious ideology, they want to control over the region that includes Saudi Arabia, that includes Mecca, right? Because they are the descendants of the Prophet, and so they are destined to rule. So with the proper help of Iran, maybe they could like continue launching the attacks on Saudi Arabia and UAE. And Houthis are known in Yemen for being for reneging on their agreements, and the way that they deal with this ceasefire and with the past ceasefires or truces is very indicative that they don't respect agreements. When it's in their interest and when it's in their to do something, then they will do it. And the only way that the only reason they actually went into the ceasefire in April, this last April, is because they were already losing in Shabwa, and in Madab. It's not because they just wanted the ceasefire. It's actually because they were losing. Otherwise, the UN and the international community has been trying to get them to agree to the ceasefire for so long in the past, but because they thought they were in a position of power, they never did that. And so you will always have a reason to worry whenever Houthis are confident about their political and military capabilities that they would launch an attack eventually.
And the question that remains in the minds of security experts is whether those attacks will one day come. Thank you to Hadil Al-Muwafaq from the Yemen Policy Center for coming on this episode of SitRep. You can follow her work at the Policy Center as well as on Twitter. I've placed links down in the show notes. I'm MJ Benias, and thanks for listening. Stay safe out there.